I acknowledge that I live, work and learn on Gadigal country. I recognise with gratitude the safe haven offered to my family at a time when life and a future was uncertain. I recognise the ongoing connections to lands, waters and skies of all traditional custodians across Australia. I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and elders past and present. Sovereignty never ceded. Good evening. My name is Estelle Roginski. I am the Vice President of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Society of Polish Jews and their Descendants. As an organisation, we are dedicated to the preservation and promotion of the historical and cultural heritage of Jewish life in Poland and its ability to foster understanding between current and future generations of the Polish and Jewish communities here in Australia. This evening, it gives us great pleasure to introduce esteemed educator and researcher, Rita Nash. Rita, in researching her parents' Holocaust survival experience, realised that it represented a sweeping and complex story which had been largely overlooked by researchers until recently. Rita's research developed into a major study, and the focus of this evening's webinar, about the Polish Jews who fled or were deported to the Soviet Union, or Flight and Survival, the Polish Jews in the Soviet Union. Remember that next week is part 2 and what happened afterwards, but for now I'll hand over to Rita. Thank you. Oh, there will be an opportunity to enter your questions in the chat, which we will come to at the end of the seminar. Thank you.
Rita, just inviting you to turn your camera on and your sound on. Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me? Everyone?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Good. Okay. Thanks, Estelle, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Eva, for facilitating the technology. And thanks to Ezra and the team for the invitation. I'll start by just telling you how I got started on this topic. My parents' narrative about their survival was Hitler invaded Poland, we ran away to Russia, and we lived there for 6 years, and we were repatriated to Poland, and we arrived in Australia in 1950, 75 years ago today, I must say. And it took me, but I was not curious at all about how that happened. And it took me a long time, say 70 years or so, and I began to ask, well, how does that happen? How do you do that? Pretty, a big thing to do. So it set me off on a journey of the most complex geopolitics that has taken years to unravel. And interestingly, I didn't find out much more about my parents' journey, but I was able to synthesize my research into a framework that still told their story, and it's a story that's told and shared by many others. So, excuse me, Estelle, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
So I can't move my screen down. I can't go to the next slide.
Oh. You should be able to do it on your screen as
No.
PowerPoint. Can you not click it through?
No. I'm pressing how I usually do it is the down arrow. It's not moving.
Eva, are you able to assist? Because I'm not sure what's going on there.
No, because I don't have the slides. So I think what we need to do, Rita, is go to your presentation and just press the letter N on next.
I can't get out of.
Yeah.
Oh, the letter N.
On your slides, on your presentation.
What, in uppercase?
And is just on next, so,
Oh, there we are. Okay.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you.
And I keep doing that now.
That's it.
Oh, no, now it's sort of unfrozen.
Perfect.
So I'm going to take you on a journey that we should all know more about. And it's, as Arnold Babel, our lovely, cherished Polish writer, he says in an introduction to a book that he wrote in 2001, this is a story about maps. Maps with shifting borders obsolete before the ink could dry. Maps crisscrossed by trains shunting uprooted wanderers thousands of kilometres east over glacial plains, an interminable journey that came to an abrupt halt at a remote station. And speaking of maps, here is a map of Poland before 1st of September 1939. Poland will never look the same again. And I might mention that many of these people who left their homes in Poland in 1939, and between then and the time they ended up in Melbourne or New York or Buenos Aires, they would have travelled half the circumference of Europe. So I'm sure I won't spend time on this, but the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed on the 23rd of August 1939, and you can see in this map what the division was. This pink area here was the eastern borderlands, which is today's Ukraine and Belarus, and that was claimed by Stalin, and the other was claimed by Nazi Germany. In a secret protocol, the two dictators set up the post-war division of Poland, sowing the seeds of the Cold War. And so on the 1st of September 1939, the German army invades Poland from the west, and everyone goes into panic, including Poles and Polish Jews. I might say now that this is not just a Jewish story, it's also a Polish story. Of course, we're concentrating on the Jews, but the Poles were, in absolute terror. There was misinformation, chaos, no organisation at all, and no idea where they would go, who should go. Families were split up, but the Jewish families particularly were absolutely terrified. And these were frantic conversations. But within 17 days, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east and annexed the eastern borderlands, as I just showed you. And that constituted 52% of the Polish landmass. And that annexation included 13 million Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, and other minorities, including 1.3 million Jews. So, what to do? Stay or go? Should you go to Hitler or should you go to Stalin? And the question boiled down to who was the lesser of two evils. And the choice was exemplified in these two quotes. There is plunder on one hand and plunder on the other, but the Russians plunder one as a citizen and as a man, while the Germans plunder one as a Jew. And I love this Bogdan's quote. So one ruler decides a person's fate, one runs this way, the other that way, and neither of them know what the future holds in store. But what can the future hold for the Jew, I ask? Here it's bad, and there it's no good. So that's pretty telling. It's also quite a good example of Jewish humour. The place who stayed were brutally murdered. Those who fled, although they had to endure the horrors of Siberia, but most survived. So, how did they go? Many of them just got into their horse and carts. Many of them were just walking, bicycles, any method whatsoever. Hundreds of thousands of citizens, Polish citizens fled, including around 150 to 300,000 Jews. Now, if you're wondering how there could be such a disparity in those figures, that's because the statistics are impossible to verify, and the variation it's always just an estimate, an educated guess. And I haven't found one bit of research that decides on one particular figure. I have decided but I'm sticking with 200 million, between 200 and 250,000. So those living in the southeast of Poland, say Lublin, they tended to head to Lvov. Those living in the northeast, say Warsaw and Białystok. But they stopped in whatever towns they could. Some of them had relatives to go to, but a lot of them didn't. And this journey required crossing several rivers. These people became refugees, and the roads were clogged. The Luftwaffe was strafing the road. There was no accommodation. Winter was approaching, and the situation was quite dire. And many never saw their loved ones again. So the borders that were being tossed up between Russia and Poland were largely determined by the river systems, and the Bug, the San and the Narev rivers, which were tributaries of the mighty Wisla, they were the rivers that had to be crossed. And they often needed people smugglers to help them get across. So there was argy-bargy going on between the German and the Soviet guards as the borders were being worked out. And finally, on the 28th of September, the German-Soviet frontier treaty was signed, and the borders were officially closed on October the 8th. In that picture, you can see the Wehrmacht soldiers removing one of the border posts between Poland and Germany. So once the Soviets had annexed the eastern borderland of Poland, what was Poland, they immediately began the process of re-colonizing and reshaping the region into the Soviet political and economic model. This was called Sovietization, and it was controlled by the KGB. The permanent residents automatically became Soviet citizens, no questions asked. And immediately life became very, very difficult. Polish banks were closed, the ruble replaced with zloty, the business factories and farms were nationalised, schools, churches and political parties were dissolved, and this included Jewish organisations. And because the Jews tended to support the Soviets, which they saw as a bulwark against the Nazis, Jews were often appointed to the bureaucracy, causing much resentment and tension with the Poles. Sorry, this is changing without my fingers. For the citizens, Sovietization was really, really difficult. The cities like Lvov and Białystok and many of the other ones they spoke of just expanded by at least a third. The overcrowding was so intense that you could only rent a bed for 12 hours and then someone would come along and rent it for the other 12 hours. Food and goods disappeared, there were flourishing black markets, there was no work, the synagogues were closed, and Russian and Cyrillic became the principal language. And for the refugees, not the people who were permanent residents, but the refugees who came over from Poland, they were offered a modified Soviet passport, a Soviet citizenship, which was a propiska or a passport or residence authorization. If you accepted citizenship, as I think my parents did, it required a commitment to work and or to join the Red Army. Rejecting the offer meant that they would be returned to Nazi-occupied Poland. You still had to register with the NKVD regardless of whether you were deciding to stay or go. And to everyone's surprise, over half of the Jewish refugees opted to return to Nazi-occupied Poland. This is an example of a refugee passport, and these two red stamps indicate that this person is Jewish. So why would you opt to go back to Nazi-occupied Poland? The main thing, obviously, is to check on their family's welfare. And life under the Soviet system was extremely hard because of the restrictions and they were impoverished. For some people, the fact that they couldn't find kosher food was quite important. And above all, they feared that taking Soviet citizenship meant they might never be able to leave home. And so the problem now was that if you did not accept Soviet citizenship, it immediately signaled to the NKVD that you were an enemy of the people, a class enemy, or socially dangerous. And that meant, and the other problem then, once the NKVD had that list, the registration to return to Nazi-occupied Poland provided them with a ready-made list of names for those suitable for deportation. And so there were 4 deportations about to be unleashed. One was, they were in February, April and June 1940, and the last one was in June 1941. You can see in those lists the sort of people they were aiming for. So what was the deportation all about? Well, they wanted to eliminate political and military resistance, suppress Polish nationalism and culture, and replace it with communist ideology. The Soviets wanted to eliminate the bourgeois elite and obtain free labour in remote areas. And on top of that, there was a nice little bit of ethnic and social cleansing going on. The main target were the Poles. The Russians hated the Poles. I think the Poles hated the Russians more, but anyway, there were 52% of the deportees were Polish, and the Jews were treated separately, so they were 30%. And again, these ridiculous statistics, between 100,000 and 200,000 Polish Jews were deported, and it said about 1 million Poles were deported as well. I think I'm not doing the table. So the standard NKVD method was always used, 2 a.m., knock on the door, pump up charges, all designed for maximum shock, panic and terror. At first, many of them thought they were going back to Poland, but they soon realised that the train was going in the opposite direction. The journey was horrendous. 3 to 6 weeks in overcrowded cattle wagons. Food was scarce and appalling, and there was never enough water. And the toilet was a hole in the floor of the wagon, often cut out by the people who themselves. And the deaths due to malnutrition and disease claimed many lives. Now, this photograph is the only known photograph of a Jewish family inside a deportation wagon. But the thing about this deportation process was summed up by Alexander Brennan, only 15 when he was deported. He said that deportation is a stroke of luck because there were no gas chambers inside the war. And where did they go? As you can see from all those red dots, they are prison and labour camps. And they were spread across the length and breadth of the Soviet Union, including Soviet Central Asia. And you can see you couldn't label all those red dots. So where were they incarcerated? They were predominantly incarcerated in coal huts, which were collective farms or sock huts, state-owned farms. I'm going to tell you a little joke. You probably all know about Zigan Schumacher, the famous Yiddish comedian. Well, Zigan had spent 6 years in Siberia in a coal hut. So his joke was, what's the difference between coal nidra and a coal hut? And the answer is, in coal nidra, you don't eat for 1 day. In a coal hut, you don't eat for a year. But most of the Polynesians were sent to special settlements, and life there was pretty abominable. As you can see by these pictures, this one always sends a chill down my spine, this special settlement in Kazakhstan. The rubric of the special settlements was whoever does not work, does not live, regardless of your physical condition. The working conditions were dangerous, the climate were extreme, primitive housing, sometimes they had to build it themselves, epidemics, severe infestations of bed bugs and things like that, and the reputation were quite pervasive. And it's thought around 30% of Jewish people who died, but I don't know how accurate that is. This photo is quite interesting because the local communities were expected to billet the deportees. And you can see the two different families there. On the left-hand side of the European women, and on the right-hand side is a Muslim family, because these are Central Asian, Kazakhstan is Central Asian peoples. And the inside of that sort of hut, I don't think I would like to have been inside. And the work. The work was mainly in forestry, mining, road building, railways, and agricultural labour. And you can see just from the pictures and the titles of these places, the worst one being the Road of Bones here, which is the Kalima Highway, which today is absolutely gorgeous. It's a six-lane highway, absolutely gorgeous, but it's one of the largest mass graves in history because of all the people who died in its construction. And they're lying there buried, still buried there. Similarly, the railways are nowhere, and the tools were so primitive, not to mention the formal punishment. But everything changed on June 22nd, 1941, when the German army broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invaded the Soviet annexed territory. This was the largest land invasion in history. And they were so successful at this that they advanced to within 16 kilometres of Moscow, which is pretty amazing. But what Barbarossa did was that it enabled the Einsatzgruppen, the special killing units, to enter into all the towns of Ukraine, Galicia, Belarus, Lithuania, and these are towns and cities, the main town that had Jews living there for generations, for hundreds of centuries, and it allowed them to systematically murder about 1.5 million Jews that currently pay Ukrainian religious leaders in just 6 months. And this is just the Einsatz being at work. And this is the main towns that were targeted, and these pink circles had over 40,000 deaths, the green ones 30,000 deaths, etc. So what happened? Everyone had to flee again. Another invasion. They had to go even further east and south to places like Tashkent and Samarkand. They were terrified. You can see they're travelling by foot again. Here is this line of people and soldiers fleeing the bombardment, and they're travelling by any means whatsoever. And they were hoping that if they went south to Tashkent and Samarkand, they believed that the climate would be more hospitable and less plenty of food. But they were very, very wrong about that. So Stalin had to invoke with pretty severe evacuation policy. Initially, the Russian scorched earth policy, which resulted in not leaving, as he says here in this radio broadcast, not leaving a single engine, a single railway car, not a single pound of grain or gallon of fuel for the enemy to use. So the aim of the evacuation was to move vital plants and people away from the invader, but continue production of military equipment. So entire farms were moved. The livestock, the grain, cultural land protection, including Lenin's and Barnes' bodies, and these evacuations were unprecedented in scope and chaos. There were 1,524 large industrial enterprises were dismantled and moved to, you can see in this map, the Ural Mountains, the Caucasus, Central Asia and Siberia. And when they got to their destination, they were rebuilt brick by brick. I love this picture here because this is a dismantled factory and it gets to Ufa where it's all just sort of unloaded. And they have to put it back together again, which is an extraordinary concept. The other thing they did with the relocations was to repurpose the factories. And one of the best examples of this was the Kirov tractor factory here. It was a factory that was moved from Leningrad to Chelyabinsk in the Ural Mountains in October. This was moved along with 15,000 of their workers. It's an extraordinary thing to have achieved. And there are a lot of lives lost, but without this repurposing, without changing the factories, then the war would definitely have been lost because it was this substantial defence production which led to the Soviet victory. So when you then come to the Sikorsky-Nicety Agreement, what I hear you say, what on earth could that possibly be? That's what I asked as well. This was on the 30th of July 1941. Operation Barbarossa brought Churchill to the realisation that he needed help, and even though he detested Stalin, he understood that the Soviet Union was necessary to defeat Hitler, and he brokered a deal between the London-based Polish government led by Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski and Soviet Foreign Minister Ivan Maesty. And the purpose of this was that all the Polish prisoners and deportees who were in those labour camps and prisons and the coal hatches, they were going to be given an amnesty and their Polish citizenship would be restored. Now, the word amnesty is very contentious and would imply that it's wrongdoing. And in fact, they had not done any wrong. But Stalin insisted because he didn't want the program of using being accused of imprisoning these people without pay. The released Poles would then form the Polish Armed Forces in the East, which was also known as the Polish Army in the USSR, and to fight against the Nazis with the Red Army on Soviet soil. Sikorski selected General Władysław Andrzej to lead this army. But first of all, they had to get him out of prison, because he was locked up in Lubyanka in Moscow. You can see this is just after his release, that picture there, and he's looking very gaunt. So the Polish state will be re-established under the government in exile with a temporary embassy in Kyiv. And I'll show you all that. Yes, this So this army, the amnesty was advertised widely in the Labour camp, the newspapers, so quite a lot of people in Stalin. The prisoners were keen to enlist in the army because they were guaranteed food, clothing and protection. And they began making their way south to the recruitment centre. However, as you can see from this picture here, they are in shocking condition. They've been starved, they needed their clothing filthy, and the condition of these children who were also imprisoned, and many of them were orphans. So Jews were often rejected due to anti-Semitism, but many of them still were able to join, and the release, as I said, the release prisons needed a lot of rehabilitation. The interesting thing about this process of recruitment for the Army was that the recruiters kept wondering why Polish officers were not coming to the recruitment centre, why they weren't signing up. And that was the first indication of the Katynia massacre. So, but not only factories were relocated, large population groups were also removed, and there were about 16 to 17 million, some say 25 million, moving south simultaneously as the prisoners, as the party officials, as the factory workers, as the families of the factory workers and the prisoners, and they were also forced evacuated. So it was this enormous bottleneck that was all converging south. There were few trains, there was no housing, there was no food, and there was no sanitation, and disease and death were very, very widespread. So, I will just give you a little slide if you'd like to see what's happening to my parents at that time. So that's my mother and father. I believe that's their wedding photo. They got married very quickly just before they ran off to the Soviet Union. And I don't know whether they went to evolve with the other stuff, but I do believe they took the Soviet position. And they ended up in Ufa, here, which is at the foot of the Ural Mountain. There's Chelyabinsk, where the tractor factory went, and there's Moscow, just to give you a comparison. And Kyiv was where the Polish temporary embassy was, and Buzaluk was the main recruitment centre for the army. So they were probably drafted into the Red Army. My father worked on the railways, and my mother selling night shift for the Red Army. They had a baby girl who died very young, and then my brother was born in Ufa in 1934, and that's him there. This is my father here, and I call this photo Red Army Road. So let's go back to the Angles Army. He was often called the Polish Moses, and this map will tell you why. So the story behind that is that Stalin was unable and unwilling to provision Angles Army. Stalin and Angles hated each other, and Stalin wanted Angles to start fighting, but Angles said that the rehabilitation of those prisoners were incomplete. And so he finally allowed Angles to move his army to Palestine to come under British control, British command. He was dubbed the Polish Moses because in two separate evacuations in 1942, one in March and one in August, he took a total of 78,000 soldiers and 37,000 civilians. And in the red dots here is one journey that goes there across through Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, across the Caspian Sea, and down to Iran, of all places, and then across here to Palestine. The other journey went down here, and he went in this direction, again, through Iran. This huge number, 78,000, included 6,000 Jews, 4,000 soldiers, and 2,000 civilians. And on top of it, 850 orphans who became known as the Tehran children, who travelled for 12 months, little kids, 10 years old. They travelled for 12 months before they got to Tel Aviv. Nearing Palestine, many of the Jews deserted, in inverted commas, because they decided they would prefer to join Kibbutzim or fight for independence. And this included Menachem Begin. And this photo here is of Begin in the Army uniform. Angus chose to turn, although he was supposed to be somewhat anti-Semitic, Angus chose to turn a blind eye to the situation, local conviction. And he then took this army to Europe and played a key role in the Italian campaign and especially at the Battle of Monte Cassino. For those Jews who've been rejected by the Angus army or have missed the amnesty, they have very limited options. So most of them headed south again to Syria or Rome. And many of them, as you can see in this photo, many of them have no way of travelling except to walk over mountains and desert in very poor clothing and very little food. They settled there in Central Asia, and again, widespread hunger, disease, overcrowding, because don't forget, Central Asia is going under its own Sovietization process. Poverty and crime were rife, the black market ruled, and they were sent to a kolkhoz if they couldn't find work. But they had somewhat of a they could have a good time. They go on outings in summer times. These Jews are holding Yiddish newspaper. Here's the wedding of the local Jewish Bukharan Jews and the Polish Jews. So it wasn't all gloom. The ZPP, or the Union of Polish Patriots in Moscow, Stalin still needed a loyal Polish army to fight with the Red Army and assist in the battle against Hitler. And so the ZPP was formed to create this army and to recruit Polish communists, many of whom were Jews, to be trained to take leading roles in a future Polish government. So in May 1943, the Kosciuszko infantry division of the Red Army was formed, and it was led by Colonel William Berlin, and this army was instrumental in entering Warsaw and also liberating Berlin. And many Jews joined and served with distinction. When the JDC realised, the joint, that is, international aid, major international aid group, when they realised that there were 200,000 or about 200,000 Jews needing help in Soviet Central Asia, they spearheaded an international operation to provide this aid. 10,000 individual parcels, you can see them here, were sent every month, and about 85% were delivered. And this was, they set up a central warehouse, post office in Tehran, and they packed inside the parcels, they packed blankets, food, clothing, plus goods that could be used for black market barter because it was recognised that they needed that. This was a truly international operation. Funding came from all over the world. The goods were purchased by the JDC from everywhere and anywhere. They arrived by boat via the Persian corridor, packed in Tehran by refugees and locals, transported by US Lend-Lease trucks which were driven by Red Army soldiers, which is pretty amazing. So, why is this story being lost until recently? Many reasons. The evolving definition of the word survivor is pretty crucial, and coupled with the hierarchy of suffering. Many of these people who went to Siberia just did not see themselves as divine Holocaust survivors. My parents certainly didn't see themselves. The other problem was that the Soviet Asiatic story was alien to the dominant narrative of survival, like, concentration camps and ghettos, all of those stories, and the death penalty. The onset of the Cold War discouraged people talking about spending time in the Soviet Union. People often, if they had children born there, they would actually change the date of their birth so that it didn't have not only the date but the place of their birth, so it didn't have, if the child was born in the Soviet Union. And I can't address any of those now, but the other thing was that the Soviet archives were not opened until 1991. And they simply wanted to get on with life. When they returned to Poland and saw the immensity of the losses there, as really as we knew, they were torn with feelings of shock, guilt, and belief. And they considered their experience to be of minor importance. And so they kept silent, and that was the major reason, as well as the definition of the Holocaust and other. But it was the poets and the writers who were able to express their feelings. From 1945 to the early 1950s, there was an intense period of publishing, especially poetry. They wrote mostly in Yiddish, but as this poem, The Shir Shapyatai by Rita, who had been in Siberia for, I think, about 6 years. And this poem sums up the enormous gulf between the different experiences. The Jewish partisans in the Parisian forest now despised his brother from the steps of Kazakhstan, and both despised the brother, the third from the bunker that Hitler did not find. And the one who succeeded in escaping death from the ghetto, the other, the gas military, now despises his brother from the Aryan side, and everyone has feels in his place. And Yeshaya Spiegel also wrote this verse poem, and this is only a tiny bit of it. I bled like you, brother, although I was thousands of miles away from the ghettos in Venezuela. In other words, I also had a hard time. It's very hard to tell somebody who's lost all their family and everything. So this story has many, many paradoxes. One of them was the most significant place of sanctuary was not Eretz Yisrael, but the birthplace of totalitarian socialism. Despite the brutality and high death rate in the labour camps, the Jews felt a certain gratitude to the Soviet Union, but they couldn't admit to that. The Oriental experience, mainly Muslim Central Asia, was starkly different from the widely known horrors of I said before. And many repatriates, when they came back to Poland, returned with family and children, while the few survivors of such death in the movie. The only comparable story of solitude was Shanghai, where about 20,000 but the Soviet Union carried around 200 10 times as many, making it a far more significant refuge. Despite this growth in numbers, as of about 3 years ago, there have been about 18 exhibitions worldwide about Shanghai, and only one part of one about the Soviet Union. I'm pleased to say that one has just opened at the Appalling Museum in Warsaw. But this is only about the return of the Jews from the Soviet Union that I presume the Soviet Union will be mentioned. So why should we care? Marek Liebhaber, who was the editor of Rita, knew just 2 years after the war that this was an important story. It was a great, rich, grand and important chapter that must not be lost. All of this show must be written down. The life of the Jewish masses in Siberian prisons, hardship, the hard labour, had to be immortal. And I'm pleased to say that finally, in the last 10 or 15 years, they are starting to, the historians are starting to recognize. So, of the 3.3 million Jews in pre-war Poland, fewer than 10%. They called themselves the Jewish populate, who was divided the world into two families. The majority of this remnant were those 200,000 Polish Jews who spent the war years in the Soviet Union, either as refugees from Nazism or deportees to Siberia, or both. Add to that the 50,000 or so who returned from the camps, in hiding, living in the forest, or on the place. Without them, there would be very few Polish Jews left at all, and I certainly wouldn't be standing here today. So, at our next meeting, next week, we're going to look at the return of the post-war decision about the carve-up of Eastern Europe, and we're going to look at the repatriation program and how the Jews attempted to create a new life in Poland. And we watch the beginning, we look at the beginning of a caring, vibrant community that they developed. And as ever, there is that scourge of anti-Semitism, the Kielce pogrom, and they have to flee again. And Stalinisation and communism take president, and they finally decide to leave Poland for good and head to the far-flung corners of the world. Thank you for listening. I'll just go into this slide here, which has reference to an article I wrote that will make more sense after next year. It's in the inaugural edition of Musings, the Sydney Jewish Museum academic journal. If any of you have a story to tell, or you would like more information about this whole huge topic, then please feel free to contact me at that email. And also, if any of your parents had experience in Siberia or Soviet Union during the war and have got any artifacts, documents, photographs, anything that would describe the life that they lived there, I'd love to know about it, because I'm hoping that one day we might get more position in Australia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita, for that comprehensive talk and erudite talk. I have to say that quite a lot of the statistics took my breath away and have left me a little bit shattered. especially since we last spoke. There are a couple of questions here in the chat which I will pose to you now. The first one is, how has the journey you've just taken us through affected your parents, and did they often talk about their experiences?
No, they didn't talk enough about it, but I also didn't ask enough about it. And I know that's a very common experience. How did it affect them? I think it affected them normally. They had a lot of mental issues, because when I'll probably tell a bit of the story next week, when they went back and they stopped in Woodland where their families were, and they were hoping to find someone, but of course there was no one there. I don't know how you face that kind of loss with a community. And so they got on a boat and came to Australia with just two little children and made a whole new life. So I think they suffered, but no, we didn't talk about it enough. And I regret, like many of you, I imagine, I regret deeply not having extended family, not having a grandmother, not having parents, uncles, aunts, cousins, like all my Australian friends.
I feel like you that the losses and the extent of those losses reverberate through generations, and we feel them acutely. There is a question here too. Would you advise someone who may want to find out more information other than contacting you? Is there a particular website or location online that somebody could access?
What a huge question. First of all, you have to decide, are you just wanting to find out your family story, right? Whether it's a kind of genealogical thing, or do you want to find out the journey that they might have taken? So that's the first thing you have to decide. As for what I've described, as I said to you at the beginning, I didn't find out anything more about my parents. Nothing, in fact. What I did was look at the big picture, and my parents fitted into that, but it didn't explain them. So why is that so? There's a few simple reasons. One is that when they went back to Poland, they had to relinquish all their Russian documents, all of their, identity, anything that they had, they were expected to return. So that's number one. Number two, the Soviet archives are still, full of stuff that hasn't been revealed yet. Number three is, if you can't speak or read Cyrillic and or Polish, then you can hardly do any research at all. So from my work only with my family, I actually was able to find an amazing Polish historian who unearthed a lot of documents for me. And I can give you his name if you contact me. This has taken me 6 years to get to this stage and to be able to tell what I told you today has required a lot of sifting, a lot of refining, and a lot of, that can't be true, and verifying. But I'm only working from what's called secondary sources, English language sources, because I don't speak Polish and I don't read it, and I would hate to be working in the Polish alphabet. It's a very deep, complex thing to set about. And the other part of that story is that all of the gulags and the special settlements and all that, hardly any record. That's very demoralising, but you can do, I think, what I did, which is to do a general look at where they might have gone and what happened to them.
There are a couple of thank yous here in the chat, which I will forward, but there's also an interesting question, and there's a bit of a blurb before it. My mother and her mother were shipped to Far East Kazakhstan in April 1940, and amazingly, her boyfriend, who was left behind in Bialystok, sent her love letters every week, which she kept, and I have translated, until June 1941. Then there was nothing. With all the chaos, how is it possible that the Soviet Postal Service delivered mail over 4,000 miles in the midst of a war?
I don't know, really. It's a lovely story. But you already, in telling that story, you've already got a few clues there, right? So, June 1941, the Germans invade the Soviet Union, right? So there are markers there. So communications would have broken down then, I imagine. The other marker was they were shipped in, when they were shipped out of Poland, but not person said. So that tells a story. I'm happy to talk about how to write this information in a way that you can provide the details that you don't actually have, but you can give a general picture. It's hard. And how did they do the postal service? Bugger if I know.
Yeah.
And when you think of the vastness of the Soviet Union, and you saw from that map I showed you how it went right across from, Moscow to Vladivostok.
And there were so many obstacles en route, everywhere at every turn. Anything could have happened. It's like, when I hear that story, I think it's nothing short of a miracle, really. I don't normally give the name of somebody who's asked a question, but you will understand who this is. Thanks, Rivkale. Can you tell us briefly what your parents told you about their exile, shared, I think, shaved by Stalin?
Saved by Stalin.
Yeah.
I think I know who that is.
I bet there's only one person who calls you Rivkale.
No.
Oh, okay.
No, that's not true, but this person does. They didn't talk very much about it at all, and I usually didn't want to hear about it, not because I just didn't care, which is a common story, but I found it the stories, especially like, for example, my mother told the story of him going to fetch water in Ufa, right? There was no running water. She had to fetch it from the well on the way with a yoke in 2 buckets. And on the way back, she slipped in the snow and lost all the water. And she had to go back. The snow was up to the middle of her thigh. That's what she had to do. There was only an outdoor dummy. I can't imagine going to the loo, to an outdoor dummy in minus 40 degrees centigrade. Yeah, thank you. She had to, when my brother was born, she had to iron his nappies dry because there was no way of washing or drying. So she would iron them to absorb some of the moisture. So these stories were really hard to listen to because all I could see was how the suffering and how hard it was, and I just didn't want to know about that. I still find it really hard to listen to, but when I was growing up, I definitely didn't. And I'll tell you one other thing when I was growing up, there was this sense of unsafety, right, in my house. And that was partly caused by the horrors of your story, which I didn't really know about. But it was also caused because my parents' marriage was difficult, and there were lots of traumas. Sorry, I got nervous. The other thing that a lot of you will know too, the fear of lack of safety, and one way they dealt with that fear was to, whenever they went overseas, to buy gold, and then hide it away. My mother never wore all this gold, but they had gold in the house, and there was money under the house. And they weren't particularly wealthy, but they had this. You had to protect yourself against any danger, like an invading army.
Rita, this has been such a compelling talk, and I'm sure that people will have many more questions that will bubble up over the week to come. So please, everybody, tune in again next week. Thank you again, Rita, for a really compelling talk. Thank you, all of you in the audience who've participated and asked questions. If we didn't get to your question this time, please save your question for next week. We may have more time. Special thanks again to Polaron and the way that they always support us and help us on so many levels. Have a really wonderful night. Thanks, everybody, and good night.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye. See you next week.